Greetings, theists and non-theists. I am the Atheist Paladin. I would like to talk to you today about the contingency argument. Boy, I've been looking into this, and it's one funny argument. Let's see how it's worded, at least according to William Lane Craig. 1. Everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either by the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. 2. If the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is God. 3. The universe exists. Conclusion 1. The universe has explanation of its existence. Conclusion 2. Therefore, the explanation of the universe's existence is God. Okay. Well, there are a few problems with the argument of contingency. 1. The first premise is backed up by the principle of sufficient reason. Basically, what it is there is no such things as brute facts, randomness, or indeterminacy. That's pretty much what the principle of sufficient reason is. Anything that has an existence has a reason for its existence. Okay, and so we must explain why existence exists too? Yeah, that's a little problematic. If you must explain why existence exists, then that implies that it's possible that there is non-existence. Right. So if it's possible that it's non-existence, then what is a necessary being? Well, a necessary being is something that cannot not exist. It exists always. It will always exist, and it can never cease existing. So it is possible for nothing to exist, except there's a necessary being. Okay, there's the first does not compute. But okay, let's go with that. But this necessary being is personal, and it's spaceless, timeless, and uncaused. Well, the first problem with the contingency argument that it has a unsaid predilection to determinacy. Like I said, because of the principle of first reason, there are no randomness, there's no brute facts, there's no indeterminacy. Because if there was, then the chain can be broken by an indeterminate event. Something that is completely random. And if you break that chain, well, then that chain fails to reach God. But the problem is once you reach God, you would have to give up your predilection to determinacy. Because if God is determined, then that would mean that that he can do something else. That, in other words, his actions are contingent upon something. So at the end of that contingency, God has to be able to do this without any sort of restrictions. Problem with that means it's a libertarian free will. But I don't know how a libertarian free will is any different than from randomness. It's just that it's not determined and it's not random. At least supposedly. So you would have to violate your predilection to determinacy in order to get to something that is not determined. So there's special pleading in there. And the idea of something that it has, that the explanation either must be within its own nature or something external to itself may also be a false dichotomy. I mean, how molecules move is not only due to the fact because something else introduced force into it, but that's also because that's its nature in and of itself. It's also due to its own nature, the nature of things that cause it, and nature's nature. So that may be actually a false dichotomy. So premise 1 has a lot of problems. But premise 2, oh, that's a doozy. That is really a big doozy. That's what William and Craig does in order to try to justify about premise 2. He says, A, if atheism is true, then the universe has no explanation of its existence. Which can be precisely reworded into B, the universe has an explanation of existence, then atheism is not true. And you can't affirm A without denying B. Well, that's the problem. I can't affirm A. Just because I don't believe in a God doesn't mean I don't have an explanation of our existence. It just doesn't include a God. It just it says if A should be worded, if there is no God, then the explanation of existence must not entail a God. Now that's true by tautology, of course. But if that's the wording, then if the universe has an explanation, but if that's the case, then B cannot be reworded as if the universe has an explanation of existence, then atheism is not true. It just wouldn't make any sense. I either could have an explanation, or it could be due to some random inexplicable fact, if the principle of sufficient reason is not valid, or there is an explanation, but I just don't know what the fuck it is. I'm just not clever enough, you know. Nobody is just clever enough to figure out what the explanation is. That's something that is never considered. So, we have good reasons to believe that neither premise 1 or 2 are true. Now, 3 is, of course, undeniable. That's something I'll also agree with Craig. Even if you would come from a sort of global skepticism, that even if you believe that you're a brain in a vat, that would still be something that is undeniable. It just means you just have to deny what you're experiencing is the actual reality. That's the only main difference. So 3 is true. But the problem is well, just because the universe has a cause, even if it does, doesn't mean it's God. And that's the problem with the argument from contingency. What the argument contingency is, it says that God is necessary. Well, what is a necessary being? Let's go back to that. Well, since a necessary being cannot exist, or a necessary being cannot fail to ever exist, that sort of kind of begs the question, doesn't it? That means if nothing existed, by brute logical fact, God must still exist. And to deny to do so would entail some sort of fallacy. That means this why do we exist even at all argument should be worded to be like, even if the universe failed to exist, God exists. Quite simply. But that's not much of an argument, is it? And that certainly doesn't prove God exists. It's simply an assertion that God exists. And all to solve the conundrum of why we even exist. We may not have an answer, and I think that's the biggest problem with the contingency argument. It may be a cause, but it may not be a God. There may be an infinite number of naturalistic reasons why we exist. Maybe also an infinite number of supernatural reasons why we may exist, but that don't include a God of this sort. So that's my idea on the argument from contingency. I mean, it just fails to prove, because that God is the beginning chain. I mean, I could say that the universe began to exist, but then the contingency argument would just say, well, that everything that begins to exist within the physical realm, so that it just be expanded to mean even the multiverse. But that's the point. If I have an explanation of the universe, I may not have an explanation of the multiverse. And if the universe also began from an indeterminate reason, then trying to explain why there's existence at all would just be impossible. It would just be beyond our logical means. And that's what I think what it is. We ultimately cannot explain why there is existence. But I mostly think that is because that non-existence is impossible. But I just don't need to regress to the point where I'll say, well, there is a thing to which has all the properties of a thinking and feeling being, yet it doesn't have time, which means it doesn't have consciousness. It doesn't have parts, so there's no ego or id or subconscious, even though we call it cognitive and self-aware. And it would exist even if there's nothing else to exist. Which is kind of a strange self-awareness. Because in order to me to be self-aware, I have to be able to relate to the environment around me. So I just don't really have to resort to that sort of thing, to where this thing can make causes to which can cause things out of nothing. And it has a consciousness that is unlike any other consciousness, and yet many would say this consciousness is also supremely simple. Yeah, that's just too much of a heavy burden for me to lift. Something strange and queer like that. If I'm going to say it exists, then I have to give up my intuition. But if I have to give up my intuition, then why are we using our intuition to come to this thing? It's kind of strange. Because that's what the principle of sufficient reason is. It's just intuition. And it's really relying on the inductive fallacy. You may be able to show that everything that we know of has a reason for why it is that way. But as soon as there's one thing, and one thing that can be shown that does not have a sufficient reason, then you either have to just beg the question and just no, it has a sufficient reason, it isn't random, it isn't indeterminate. But if we're going to go that route, then it's the gut of the gaps fallacy. You're just simply asserting, because we don't have an answer, we can't figure it out, what the real sufficient reason is, that you assert that this God is the answer. Or you just can't make the case against something where that randomness or brute facts or indeterminacy does not exist. It is a no-win situation. You just cannot get to God with the contingency argument. There are just too many roadblocks. So, thank you for watching my video. I'm the TheAtheistPaladin, and remember, rationality is the path to righteousness.